Hello everyone. In this mini lecture, I'm going to talk about experiment 2 and 3, hardenability of steel and temperature. Here are the major objectives of this experiment. From the experiment, you'll learn the basic heat treatment technique of steel such as annealing, quenching, and tempering, and you are going to run impact tests and hardness tests to see the effect of different heat treatment on the mechanical property of steel. You also study the microstructure of steel after different heat treatment and understand the phase transformation at different cooling rate. You also learn the concept of hardenability of steel and how to use geometry tests to measure it. Okay, steel can form different microstructure and phases at different cooling rate. This behavior can be expressed using continuous cooling transformation diagram as one example I show here. On the x-axis is the times, and the y-axis is the temperature, and the cooling method is corresponding to a cooling curve with the cooling rate right like this. Okay, so there's a boundary for different formation of the phases. For example, a very cooling rate such as this red dashed line has a 140 Celsius per second will result microstructure of phases as a martensite. A slow cooling rate such as 35 Celsius per second will give a microstructure as a pyrrolite. Okay, I have an example of pyrrolite and martensite microstructure I showed here. Pyrrolite, as the same as the physics we have seen in the previous experiment, has a laminar structure as I showed here. That's because the slow cooling rate allowed the atom to diffuse into ferrite and cementite into alternative layer structure. That's why we have the white and the dark phase mixed together. Pyrrolite structure is usually give the material, steel material, a soft and ductile behavior, which will tend to increase the toughness of the steel. A martensite, as an example I show here, only form when the cooling rate at a very high rate, and that is no diffusion can occur. So the formation of martensite is a diffusionless process. Because everything happens so quick, you can see the structure of the martensite has a high distortion and a long structure, pretty much like a needle. Let's make the martensite usually have very high internal strength energy. Martensite usually give the steel material high strength, but it also make it very brittle. Okay, so let's talk about the experiment. So in this experiment, you're going to receive two different samples. You're going to receive 3 Sharpie samples, and you're going to also receive 1 geometry sample. And because we want before the experiment, before the heat treatment, we want to heat up the sample to 100 C. Based on the phase diagram, it's pretty safe to say at 100 C, the steel material is at alternate state. Then we're going to apply different heat treatment method at different cooling rate to manipulate the mechanical and the microstructural property of the steel. So we have 2 parts of the experiment. Part 1, we are going to compare different quenching or cooling method, and we are going to use the Sharpie sample. So you have 3 Sharpie sample. We're going to use 1 Sharpie sample and quench it in water. The second one will quench in oil, and the third one will be used as a reference sample. You just cool the sample in air until it reach the room temperature. Once all the samples have been cooled, then we're going to perform an impact test to measure the impact energy, and then we're going to cut a piece of material from each of sample and polish specimen, and to study the microstructure of the steel from different cooling methods, and then we're going to take a measurement of the hardness. That's part 1. Part 2, we are going to perform a standard Germany test, and we're going to put the heated Germany specimen into this water fountain, and the water fountain has certain flow rates that shoot the water at the bottom, and it will quench the sample at the bottom. Okay, this cooling process will take from 10 to 20 minutes. Once the entire sample gets cool, we're going to grind the side of the sample to get a band for hardness measurement. Then we are going to use a hardness Germany sample holder for measure the hardness profile along the length. Here is the imaging of the experimental setup we're going to use, and this is the Germany sample, and here is the hardness indenter, and we have a magnet to hold the sample, and this sample setup has a location mark as a ruler shown over here. The location mark is associated with the distance of the indenter measurement to the end of the Germany specimen. Okay, so let's talk about what kind of result you would expect from this experiment. From the quenching and from the Sharpie sample, we are comparing different quenching method, and the different quenching method is associated with the cooling curve on this diagram. Okay, for example, the normalized sample is corresponding to this cooling curve of normalization. That is the sample cool in air, which will give the phases majorly at 5 pure light. And the water quench sample is corresponding to this cooling curve, which will give a structure of martensite. And the oil quench sample has a slower cooling rate than the water quench, but have a faster cooling rate than normal sample. Is the cooling curve looks like this, which will give structure of martensite and pure light. And here's an example of the microstructure you're most likely to see. For the normalized sample, the microstructure is the same as you see in the previous experiment. And we have a ferrite at the white region and a pure light at the dark region. If you look at in detail, the pure light have a laminar structure. Okay, the quencher sample will give most of region martensite. As you can see, the martensite has a microstructure of pretty much like a needle. This white region is it's called retained austenite, which I'm going to talk about that later. And the oil quench microstructure pretty much is a mixture between these two materials. You can see some region on the martensite and also some region of a ferrite, because the majority of this majority of the sample from the normal sample are ferrite. Okay, if you compare the result of the toughness and hardness, you would like to see that the water quench sample has high strength, and the normal sample has the lowest strength. And you can see the trend increase as the trend of strength increase as the quenching rate increase. If you compare the impact energy as the toughness, you would like to see that the normalized sample have highest impact energy, and the water quench sample have the lowest, and the oil quench is somewhere in between. Okay, so let's talk about the hardness. Let's talk about the Germany test and how we use that to measure the hardenability of steel. So hardenability is a term that used to designate the property of steel, which determines the depth and distribution of hardness introduced by the quenching from the austenite state temperature. So what it does is, here is a diagram of our hardness sample, and here's the bands for our hardness measurement. So at different location of the measurement of the hardness is associated with a certain cooling rate or a cooling curve on this diagram. For example, at the end of the Germany sample, that is very close to the end, it's associated with the cooling rate curve that is the dashed line with the letter A, which will result phases mostly martensite. At the middle location, when the measurement takes at the middle of the sample, which is the location is associated with the cooling curve at D, and it has a very slow rate, which will cause the formation of a majorly pure line. And somewhere in between, like the location B and C, is also associated with the cooling curve rules. In example shown here, as a mixture of martensite and pure line, and etc. So you would likely to see the hardness gradually decrease as the distance increase from the crunch end. Okay, and you also see some of this bump on this curve. That's because of our experiment setup, which I'm going to talk about in the next slides. Okay, so this geometry curve is actually characteristic data or property to a certain material. You can actually compare this geometry curve to a standard geometry band from ASM handbook. However, if we put this ASM handbook I show here, we can see that the hardness measurement for our experiment is lower than what is supposed to be. That's because in our experimental setup, the magnet is not strong enough to hold the sample. Whenever we take a hardness measurement, the indenter will actually push down the sample and make the sample to flip. That will lower the measurement from its actual value. To solve this problem, we basically shift the entire curve by a value of 20 HR. Okay, so the third experiment we're going to do is still tempering. We do tempering because a water quench sample usually make the material too brittle to use. As I show a microstructure here, the rattan austenite is a very soft material, and tempering actually reduce the size of the rattan austenite region to let it diffuse. And also, tempering can also release a lot of distortion energy from the martensite to make it more ductile or more tough. So in this experiment, we're going to study the tempering process at a different temperature. Here is the tempering profile of the temperature we're going to use in this experiment. You're going to have 4 Sharpie samples. At first, you're going to heat it up them to at 100 C for 30 minutes. Then you will perform the first water quench. And then you will give a microstructure looks like this. Then you're going to put the 4 Sharpie sample at 4 different tempering temperature for 30 minutes and perform the second water quench sample. Then you're going to perform the impact test and the hardness test to see how the toughness and hardness change by different tempering temperature. Okay, that's a major part of the experiment. We also want you to compare the fatigue resistance of steel caused by different temperature. So you will receive a steel wire, and this wire from the paper clip, and then you will perform the same heat treatment as they do as a Sharpie sample. Then you will bend the wire back and forth and write down the number of cycles to fill it. So this pretty much is the overview of this experiment, and good luck.